Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Managing Metals and Minerals, Key Takeaways from the 2019 OECD Green Growth and Sustainable Development Forum. I'm Minori Lee and I'm the project lead for the Green Industry Platform, which aims to provide small businesses with the knowledge they need to become more competitive by going green. The Green Industry Platform was launched earlier this year by the GGKP, the Green Growth Knowledge Partnership, a global community of organizations and experts that aim to provide the policy, business, and finance communities with knowledge, guidance, data, and tools to transition to an inclusive green economy. For those that are unfamiliar, the partnership was established in 2012 and is led by the Global Green Growth Institute, the OECD, UN Environment, UNIDO, and the World Bank. Last week, the OECD held the 2019 Green Growth and Sustainable Development Forum, the GGSD, focusing on greening heavy and extractive industries, innovation, and fiscal implications. Today, we'll recap key messages from the forum on how to improve the environmental and social performance of the mining sector and the minerals industry. In addition to providing an opportunity for those who are unable to attend the GGSD forum to get an experience of the discussions, this webinar supports the UNEA 4 resolution on mineral resource governance. Before we get started, I'd like to encourage all of you to raise questions throughout the webinar. It's a great opportunity to engage directly with our speakers from UN Environment, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, E3G, and of course, the OECD. Just type your question into the chat box and our team will share it for our panelists to address during the Q&A period. After the webinar, we'd appreciate if you could take 5 minutes to complete our webinar survey. Your feedback is really valuable to us and will help us shape our future webinars. If you have any technical issues, email us at contact@ggkp.org and we'll help you troubleshoot. Finally, please note that a full recording of today's webinar, including all of today's presentations, will be available on the GGKP website shortly after the webinar. Now, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Kumi Kitamori, who leads the Green Growth and Global Relations Division at the OECD. She oversees the mainstreaming of green growth in the work of various policy committees of the OECD and in member and other partner countries. This includes a dedicated program that promotes green growth policies, finance investment, and investment in the Eastern Europe, Caucasus, and Central Asia region. Kumi, I am delighted to welcome you to today's webinar, and I hereby turn it over to you.
Thank you, Minori, for the kind introduction. And thank you very much, GGKP, to provide this opportunity for us, the OECD, who organized this conference last week on greening the heavy and extractive industry, and then to be able to share the key messages that came out of it with the wider audience. And I'm delighted to be joined by many colleagues who will speak and share their perspective after me. So I would like to briefly start by just summing up some of the key messages that came out of that meeting. So at the OECD, for those of you who may not be familiar, just in case, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and we have a specific program that's that's addressing different aspects of green growth, which is quite wide in coverage. And the OECD holds its annual Green Growth and Sustainable Development Forum, and the particular focus this year was on the heavy and extractive industries. And in order to achieve even the 2-degree goal under the Paris Agreement, and then to reach the aspired 1.5-degree limit, it's essential to ensure that the heavy and extractive sectors play their role. Much progress has been made already in the low carbon transition, notably in the renewable and the power sector, but the so-called hard to abate sectors such as steel and cement, chemicals, but also extractives, oil and gas, and mining, increasingly the focus of international debate. And as we know, heavy industry was one of the themes at the UN Climate Summit last September. So we had a very interesting set of panelists We had a keynote scene-setting presentation provided by Lord Ada Turner, who is the chairman of the Energy Transition Committee. And then we had some keynote speakers from several governments, including Korea. And then we also had very important participation of business representatives from oil and gas sector, chemicals, steel, cement, and extractives. And then I'm very happy that some of those who participated and spoke at the conference are joining us at this webinar. Just to share with you some of the key messages that came out was that, as Minori said, two aspects were fiscal implication, because some of the countries that rely on natural resource-based sectors, such as oil and gas and minerals and mining, very often these countries have their large share of their fiscal revenues coming from these sectors. So as we move in the low carbon transition, and if we are trying to move away from oil and gas and coal, what does it mean for the tax revenues for these countries that rely on them or that are the main exporters, but also for importing countries? Very often energy use is a very important tax base. So that's one aspect that was discussed. So therefore, in this context, tax and subsidy reforms are among the key drivers for the low carbon transition. And another prominent speaker, that was Mr. Yanis Patashnik, who is the co-chair of the UNEP's International Resource Panel. He pleaded passionately that it does not make sense for the same governments to be subsidizing fossil fuel while they're discussing low carbon transition at another forum. So that was one key message that came out very strongly. But another aspect is that due consideration is needed for the social and distributional implication of the fiscal policy reforms. Identifying inclusive solutions requires social dialogues engaging all stakeholders, including workers and local communities. Very often, if you look at one country level, an average impact on job losses because of the low carbon transition may not be that great, but very often averages mask the disparities in various location or region-specific impacts, because very often heavy industries and extractive activities tend to be concentrated in certain regions within a country. Another point that came out strongly was the need for resource-rich countries to diversify their economy. And Buddy, who will speak later today in this webinar, highlighted that extractive revenues account for over 70% of government revenues for some countries. So that's a very important agenda. Not easy, but it needs to be addressed. Similarly, we need place-specific solutions within countries because of the regional disparities that are linked to the low carbon transition's impact that would be held. And that means bottom-up approaches coming from local entrepreneurs, including SMEs, that provide opportunities for job creation in the local business development. Another key implication, still staying within this fiscal implication part, is the role of sovereign wealth funds for the resource-rich countries to contribute to low carbon transition was highlighted. There is a potential of the rare minerals curse to replace the fossil fuel reserve curse. So that is something, as the demand for minerals increase together with the low carbon transitions, because very often some of these metals and minerals are underpinning certain low carbon technologies, especially for batteries. Another important aspect was that of innovation. Another key message that came out very strongly was that innovations in both technologies and business models are required to support the shift to the heavy and extractive industry to low carbon and circular economy. And for this, we learned that specific strategies and roadmaps are being elaborated already. For example, the OECD's partner on the energy side, the International Energy Agency. But last but not least, governments play a very, very important role to create long-term policy certainty This includes carbon pricing and other regulatory frameworks that create enabling conditions for R&D and breakthrough technologies, and to build the infrastructure required for the industry to shift towards a low carbon and circular economy. So these are some of the key takeaway messages. And now I would like to introduce our panelists that will follow today. We are going to start with Elisa Tonda. She's the head of consumption and production unit of the economy division of United Nations Environment Program in Paris. And then after that, we'll be joined by Kirsten Virginia Glenn. She is the working with the International Resource Panel of UNEP. And then she's going to share with us some of the key relevant messages coming from their work. And after that, we'll be joined by Bari Balde. She is from the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative Secretariat, and he is the Regional Director for Africa. As I mentioned, he was one of the speakers at this OECD conference, Green Growth Forum last week. And then finally, we will hear from Ronan Palmer. He is he's leading the E3G, Third Generation Environmentalism, a clean economy program. So let's turn over to Elisa, and I think she has a PowerPoint presentation to share with the panel.
Thank you very much, Kumi, for giving me the floor. And good morning, good afternoon to everybody who is connected to the webinar. And just in order to dive in immediately into one of the points that Kumi has been mentioning, which is the one on innovation and rethinking business models or economic models around which we are planning the development of the sector and the value chains, I'm asking to please directly move to the next slide, who will allow me to comment how we feel the extractive and mining sector plays actually a very, very important role to support the transition towards sustainable development and to achieve many of the goals which are reflected in the 2030 agenda and in the sustainable development goals. And this obviously comes together with the sustainable management of that sector and making sure that the way in which that sector operates and connects is indeed oriented to that goal of sustainability. These being reflected both in numerous reports, but also being recognized by member states at the 4th session of the UN Environment Assembly in March earlier this year, in the context of one of the approved resolution, Resolution 19, which is really flagging both the importance of the sector and the sound management of the sector towards sustainable development, but also calling to explore approaches and options through which that sustainability can be achieved. And one of the dimensions that has been put forward is to make sure that the sector and the value chain associated with it is an active contributor to developing more sustainable consumption and production patterns and models, and promoting circularity as a way to not only advance on goal 12 of the Sustainable Development Agenda that specifically calls towards responsible consumption and production, but also helps move ahead towards multiple other goals. Next slide, please. And just to make sure we all start from the same understanding of this idea, we want to recognize that circularity is indeed a way and an approach that challenges the current model of our economy, the current linear setting, infrastructure, and practices that are surrounding us. And it's doing so by pushing us to rethink and redesign that economy and that system in such a way that the resources in the economy are actually kept in the economy at their highest possible economic value for as long as possible. And this builds on a prerequisite that came really very strongly in the discussion that were held in the context of the OECD Forum, recognizing that the transformation of the economy and the contribution of those sectors to the transformation of the economy do require a call and a participation of all the actors of the value chain being jointly associated with it, and all the actors taking the responsibility that they have in their different stages and the different steps of the value chain. Next slide, please. And one of the points that we would want to underline is that this approach is actually an approach that enables us to address three environmental, but not only environmental, pillars that are the foundation of the work of our organization, the UN Environment Programme. Pillars that speak to moving towards an economy where we can achieve more decarbonization, detoxification, and decoupling the pressure on resources from pollution and environmental impact. Because we do perceive, obviously, that keeping resources into the economy, building more circular economies, are actually allowing us to transform the trajectories that we currently have in terms of pressure on natural resources, extraction of resources of the environment. And you see in the slide the projections that the colleagues of the International Resource Panel have been presenting to us in the context of the Global Resources Outlook, launched as well in March earlier this year. And next slides, please. But in doing so, allow us to contribute to other key environmental pillars, which are reducing the climate impact associated with the extractions of resources, as well as reducing the pressure that we would exercise on biodiversity and natural resources, by again keeping those resources for as long as possible in our economies and keeping them at the highest possible economic value. Next slide, please. Therefore, the way in which we understand our approach towards keeping those resources in the economy, building economies that are more circular in nature, is obviously shifting away from the linear model, which you see in this image represented by the gray dotted line, and rethinking our economies towards more circular one, keeping in mind that there are different circles that can be achieved. They can be circles that engage different stakeholders, circles that are created at the level of consumers by reducing or reusing resources. There are circles that change the relationship between consumers and producers and businesses. And there are circles that are more related to the business-to-business domain. And this takes me back to one of the points that I made earlier, but came out also very evidently in the discussion at the OECD Forum, which is the importance of aligning, sharing responsibility at the different levels of the value chain to make sure that that transformation to a more circular, sustainable, and inclusive economy is acted upon by the different stakeholders that are part of the value chain. Next slide, please. There are obviously different ways and different solutions and different actions that need to be put in place to create those circles, and different point in which the pressure and the attention is exercised. There are initiatives that specifically look at the role of consumers, including government as consumers, and there the dimension of embedding circularity in procurement practices to transform, to create market for more sustainable goods and services is particularly important, but also pressures that can be exercised at the level of the way in which products are designed or materials are part of the product, and therefore creating economics incentives towards the use of resources that are already in the economy rather than on the use of primary materials is particularly important. We should not forget the important role that investors and the finance community would be playing into that domain, a point which also emerged in the discussion at the OECD forum, and the way in which initiatives, projects, and businesses that are transitioning towards circularity would be recognized and will be supported into that transformation. Building a more circular and inclusive economy would also require new skill sets, and therefore the role of education and engaging with the labor market is also particularly important. Without having the expectation of having been exhaustive in reflecting the different type of intervention and action that can be put forward, it still is really very important to recognize that different instruments, different tools, and different solutions need to come together in order to make sure that the different actors that are part of this transformation towards circularity are incentivized in that process. Next slide, please. So a point which I made extensively, everyone needs to be engaged and needs to see an opportunity and needs to feel being part of the solution. And these would definitely require rethinking our system of production and consumption and rethinking them in a key which is innovative, which is not improving slightly what we're currently doing, but really thinking differently on how we can design a system in which resources are kept for as long as possible in the system, and a system which offers opportunities to all the stakeholders of the value chain. If we can please move to the next slide. That will allow me to make one last point, which I consider particularly important and which again emerged a lot in the course of the discussion at the OECD forum, which is that we currently are very clear that there is a difference between our current system, our current models of consumption and production, and what we want to achieve, what we want to move towards. And in transitioning between the current system and a more circular and inclusive economy, we would definitely need to manage that transition and that transformation in such a way that it really provides benefits and opportunities to everybody, and that we can really take full advantage of the opportunities for businesses, but also to tackle environmental crises such as the climate crisis or the biodiversity crisis, as well as to make sure that we cater in these new systems for jobs improvement, further opportunities, and we do not and we keep in mind that that transformation is a transformation that needs to address and lessen inequalities rather than widening them. Therefore, key point there is that while the path might not seem immediate, there will need to be a clear management of those who might not be the winners in this scenario, might be the loser of this transformation, and need to be brought in such a condition that they would be benefit from the shift from a linear to a circular model. My next slide, please. Just to add a reference to the fact that while this was just a quick snapshot of our thinking and our work on this subject, more can be found on the UNEP Circularity platform that can be accessed both from the UNEP website as well as through the GGKP platform. And again, thank you very much for the opportunity of sharing some of thoughts, which I hope will be further discussed in the question and answer session. And Kumi, I'll give the floor back to you.
Much, Elisa, for sharing that presentation and the key message from UNEP with us. Now, let us turn to Kirsten Glenn, as I introduced earlier. So she is coming from the perspective of UNEP's International Resource Panel. She comes from the International Resource Panel Secretariat. So over to you, Kirsten.
Thank you very much, and hello to all of the listeners wherever you may currently be. I am going to present Dr. Yanis Patashnik's key messages from the OECD forum, as he unfortunately could not take part in the webinar today. First slide, please. For the first time ever in human history, we face the emergence of a single and tightly coupled human social ecological system of planetary scope. We are more interconnected and also more interdependent than ever before. Our individual and collective responsibilities have enormously increased. Resource use and management is very important in our economy today, as it supports companies, produces competitiveness, but it also has very intense environmental impacts, which, please, next slide, brings me to the economy. If we look at the Inclusive Wealth Index that was published by the UN last year, we can see an evolution in the past years. The Inclusive Wealth Index includes production capital, human capital, and natural capital. If we look at the topmost gray dotted line, it represents production capital per capita, and it has increased almost 100% in the past 22 years, closely followed by the next line, which represents GDP. The blue dotted line is human capital, which has been more or less at a steady rate, and the bottommost, the green line, is natural capital, which has decreased by 40%. What is this? What does it mean in conclusion? That the growth of GDP in the past decades has been achieved at the cost of depleting our natural capital. Next slide, please. Furthermore, we have relentless demand. The global resource use, as my colleague Elisa has already mentioned before, has more than tripled since 1970, according to findings of the International Resource Panel. Furthermore, material demand keeps increasing steadily. And interestingly, the black line that you can see on the graph is material productivity, which is the efficiency of the use of resources per unit of GDP produced. It has fallen or decreased since 2000 and is now at a steady rate. The question is, how is this possible? It is actually because we have a shift in production and we have a lot of outsourcing going on. Just imagine the clothes that you buy today are usually produced in a different country, and those countries are usually or normally less resource efficient. Next slide, please. In terms of the environmental impacts in the value chain, resource extraction and the processing phase are directly linked to 90% of global biodiversity loss and water stress. Furthermore, to 50% of global climate change impacts and 1/3 of air pollution, which has health impacts, again, according to the findings of the International Resource Panel. Below in this slide, you will see different circles, and the light gray color represents metals, and the orange color the non-metallic minerals. If we take a closer look at the climate change impacts and also the particulate matter and health impacts on the bottom right side of the slide, it is evident that both metals and non-metallic minerals extraction is directly linked to this and has direct impacts of about 20%. And it is also interesting to note that human beings, unfortunately, are not as much concerned with the fact that resources are being depleted. They are more concerned once resources impact their health and their well-being. Which leads me to my next slide, please. The IRP's decoupling concept. What it basically is, one of the key messages, is that we would like to achieve an increase of human well-being, an increase of economic activity and growth, and at the same time, we want to halt resource use and to also decrease the impact it has on environmental, the environmental pressures and the environmental impacts. And achieving decoupling is possible. It can deliver substantial social and economic benefits, including the repair of past environmental damages, while at the same time supplying economic development and human well-being. Next slide, please. This pie chart from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation represents the total current emissions. On the left side, we see 55% energy and 45% on the right side from products, it says. So what this graph is trying to say is that so far, our mitigation strategies, our strategies to impact the climate crisis have been focusing on the left side of the pie chart on energy through renewable energy, energy efficiency. However, what we still need, the missing link, is to impact the right side of the pie chart, the 45% that go into the production of food and land management, etc. And this can be achieved, as my colleague Elisa has already explained, through circular economy. And in a 2050 circular scenario, emissions could be reduced by 38% by altering our built environment. Furthermore, emissions could be reduced by 70% through more circular economy and different types of passenger cars. And also 49% of the emissions could be reduced through the food system. Next slide, please. So once again, just to emphasize, circular economy should be seen as an instrument to deliver decoupling and as part of the bigger picture of economic, societal, and cultural transformation that is needed to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals. Next slide, please. So why is this change difficult in practice? It is because deep systematic change requires long-term rethinking. However, most actors in our value chain and society today use short-term focus and logic. Furthermore, production and consumption systems are based on the logic of consumerism, which is fueled by quantity-driven profits and growth measured by GDP. GDP can best be explained by saying that we will not reach the goal by walking faster if we're actually walking in the wrong direction. And lastly, a transition to a more sustainable economy and society will only be possible if it is just, fair, and inclusive. Next slide, please. Is this going to be easy? Albert Einstein was once asked how it can be possible that actually humankind has discovered the structure of the atom and yet not been able to develop the political means to keep the atom from destroying us all. And what was Einstein's response? He said that, and please click on the button, that is simple, my friend, it is because politics is more difficult than physics. Now, lastly, next slide, please. I would like to make you aware of the IRP's Mineral Resource Governance Report. This summary report has already been released and is available online on our website for download. The full report is expected to be released early next year. And in light, next slide, please, of the United Nations Environment Assembly Resolution number 19 on mineral resource governance, I would like to detail to you what it is that we are currently planning, which actions we are taking to follow up on this resolution and to feed into UNEA 5. Next slide, please. We are currently, we are going to develop a discussion paper which will summarize the IRP's Mineral Resource Governance Report. It will also summarize the main findings of the GRID Geneva and UNEP 2019 Sand and Sustainability Report, and it will also summarize the GRID Arundel UNEP 2017 Mine Tailings Storage Report. With this summarized paper and with these findings, we will be conducting regional stakeholder consultations next year in all 5 major regions of the world. And the aim is to obtain feedback on the current extractive industries in those regions to gather and get information on the political landscape, as well as the needs pertaining to all of the regions. Lastly, with all of this information, a report will be developed that will feed directly into UNEA 5 with all of these findings and hopefully recommendations. And the hope is that possibly one day there could be a resolution or something similar in this field. And all of this is made possible due to the generous contribution of Switzerland. Thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation. And I'm handing back to you, Kumi.
Okay, thank you very much, Kirsten, for sharing with us. And then for highlighting the importance of what was adopted at the last UN Environment Assembly on the resolution on mineral resource governance. And and maybe some of participants on the webinar can take part in the regional consultations. And I think these last two presentations by Kirsten and Elisa went well together. And one of the take-home for me is that the low-carbon transition is not only about the energy system, but also about materials and products. OECD did a similar analysis, but looking forward to the future, to projecting to 2060, and came up with very similar messages that the importance of the materials handling sectors in terms of the global low carbon transition. And so therefore, the points that Elisa made about the need to keep the materials and resources as long as possible in the economy to avoid extraction of the virgin material, that's very important. Let us now turn over to Buddy Balde from the Extractive's Industry Transparency Initiative. Over to you, Buddy.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Buddy Balde, I'm the Africa Director here at the Secretariat. I will discuss very briefly with you about the EITI, present very briefly a few facts and figures on the dependence of some countries' dependence on the extractive sector, the impact of climate crisis on some vulnerable communities, and set out very briefly how the EITI can contribute in addressing those challenges. Next slide, please. So, as you may know, the EITI is a global standard for transparency and good governance in the extractive industries. We have 52 EITI member countries that are implementing the standard today. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, I wanted to show you a little bit more about some data on the dependence of some countries, extractive countries, countries dependent on the extractive sector. So I will use two variables for that. The first one being the GDP, and here you will see on this slide, 8 out of 10 most dependent countries on the extractive sector are countries that are implementing the EITI today. And you will see here the Republic of Congo, not to be confused with the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is number 5 on this list. But for all those 10 countries, you will see that anywhere between 25 to 43% of their GDP comes from the extractive sector, which is a significant share of the economy itself. Next slide, please. In addition to the metrics on the GDP, the even more salient metrics is on the fiscal revenues that countries' government collect from the extractive sector. And here we have detailed information for EITI member countries, so this is only for EITI member countries. And what we can show here is in 14 EITI member countries, more than 20% of revenues come from the extractive sector, anywhere between 20 to 83%, 40 more or less there. This is obviously very significant. It means that actually for the top 5 countries, it's more than 50% of the revenues come from the extractive sector. And it means that if we talk about issues related to the transition from high carbon to low carbon economy, as many of these countries are oil producers, there will be a significant effect on how that will have an effect on their finances and in countries that are often relatively poor. Next slide, please. I want to illustrate a little bit the impact of the climate crisis on some of these communities that also happen to live in the same countries that are dependent on natural resources for revenues. This is the Lake Chad. On your top right, you will see a map of the Lake Chad in 1973, the size of the lake, and you will see at the bottom right the same map in 2017. And it's the lake lost about 90% of its size between 1960 to 2010. in 50 years, to 90% of the lake, water of the lake has vanished, and that is highlighted here in green. The only small part of water now is the blue on the bottom right. What that means is an increased competition for resources for these communities, and you can also notice how the lake is strategically located in between 4 countries that all depend on the communities living around those lakes, all depend on the lake for their livelihood, and that is Chad itself, Niger, Nigeria, and Cameroon. And so this crisis is very salient for this community, for fishing, for grazing, for all kind of all their entire lifestyle that they have been used to from generation to generations. Next slide, please. What can the EATAC do in helping address this issue? 2 things. One is data, and second is dialogue. First one is on data. So this is just a brief overview of the kind of data the EATI member countries produce, and as per the EATI global standard. So it's often contract and licensing data, it's production data, it's revenue allocations, revenue collections by of fiscal revenues and allocations, social economic expenditures that earn or some kind of revenues that are earmarked to specific project or specific communities. So it's a detailed reporting on the entire value chain of the extractive sector to make sure that the natural resources benefit citizens. It is a difficult challenge. It's a long-term challenge. We have come a long way in terms of disclosure, but obviously that is not necessarily, doesn't always translate in change in practice. Next slide, please. And the other aspect of this equation that the EATI is a platform for dialogue. And here what we can offer is, we know that finding the right solutions is only part of the answer. Evidence-based policies and well-thought-out policies is only part of the answer. It also requires dialogue and education with affected communities to set out how to transition from one form of economic structures to another form of economic structures. So you can take the example of oil subsidies, for example. It is an issue where increasingly EATI asks for specific disclosure on that, but it requires more dialogue and extensive discussion and education to explain the intricacies and the effects and how that may not be the most efficient use of the resources going forward. Next slide, please. Another aspect I want to highlight is the environmental reporting requirement as part of the EATI standard, and that is relatively new for us. And a new standard was launched at the EATI global conference in June in Paris this year, and that standard sets out these guidelines for specific disclosures on environmental issues, including environmental tax-related issues, and in cases where there are CO2 taxes that are reported in EATI, and tax penalties on pollutions and so on, those are also reported as part of the EATI. Next slide, please. Finally, it's an example that I want to highlight as part of that kind of reporting, which is this is coming from Germany, which is also an EATI member. And here in that particular EATI report, you will see how the environmental impacts are compensated for, how the state can guarantee that rehabilitating costs do not fall on taxpayers, the amount of water consumed by extractive sector in each state, the rules, fees for water usage, and so on and so forth. So that's just one example of reporting. There are many other countries that are piloting and going a little bit beyond what is required by the standard itself. And those are some of the early data that is now coming in. Next slide, please. That's what I want to highlight with you, share with you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Buddy, for sharing this important work being done by the the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. Very interesting. We have some questions coming in, but let's hold those. I think they are related to some of the issues happening around Africa, for example, but we'll come back to you, Buddy, on this. Meanwhile, you can read up some of the questions that came, I think, targeting you, who might be the best place to answer. Let us turn now to our last panelist who will be presenting, Ronan Palmer. He is from E3G, the third generation environmentalism. He's heading the work on clean economy program. So over to you, Ronan.
Thank you very much, Kume, and thank you to everyone joining this workshop today. My reflections on today's, on the workshop of last week and on the speakers who've spoken just before me are really trying to take this from a business perspective now. So we have seen the big picture around the circular economy and the big issues that companies have to deal with. How then should a company respond? So if we move on to the next slide, please. I thought that the discussion in Paris last week was really helpful because it set that context, the Sustainable Development Goals, and indeed we talked about all of the Sustainable Development Goals, I think, got a mention at some stage during the 2 days. Clearly, it was very much in the context of addressing climate change, and Buddy's very strong demonstration of what has happened Lake Chad just illustrates how significant this is. I felt the conference and the speakers of the conference really brought out the importance of extractive sector within total supply chains that deliver consumer and manufacturing goods across the world, its importance to public finance, its importance in terms of jobs and to local communities, and indeed to wider communities along the delivery chains for extractive industry. And of course, as Elisa and Kirsten pointed out earlier, very much we have to think about this in terms of the move to a more circular economy. Now, it was very positive, but if we can move to the next slide, I think there are some questions that businesses will need to be thinking in terms of how do they adapt and how does the economy, as it were, change. Firstly, you can't make money in a 3-degree world. We need to do something about climate change, quite obviously. I'm not saying you can't make any money, it will just be much, much more different. And we very often think in terms of the disruption of climate change policies and mitigation policies. Don't forget, again, going back to Buddy's slide, that disruption is real already. So businesses know they need to change. Also, a lot of the discussion is in terms of new policies, but don't forget the world itself is changing. Temperature is changing, hydrology is changing, agricultural practices will be changing. So I think that the challenge the business face really needs to reframe how governments and businesses make some choices, particularly in the next few years, and particularly for firms in the extractive sector and the sectors that deliver their products to the market, because these are very long-term investments. These require very long-term relationships. So if we can move on to my third slide, please. I've tried to set this out in 2 different ways that a business could frame its situation today. And these are not 2 alternative ways of looking at the world. I think what I'm trying to say is that businesses need to look to solutions for the present issues, but they need to be preparing themselves for the future. So, firstly, how about addressing the present? There certainly is a need for policy incentives. I note that in the discussion, we often talk about carrots more than sticks. In fact, it is true that we will need much stronger regulations. I noted that has been coming up in some of the questions that people are asking. So businesses and consumers really need to think not just about incentives, positive incentives to do things differently, but actually to get used to the fact that there will be some tough regulations that will be adopted. Secondly, I think there are some great innovations, both in products and in business models. Innovation will not solve everything for everybody. Again, this is not an argument not to innovate. It is actually an argument to do more innovation, but respect that innovation is not the only thing that will help. And of course, there are some businesses that we speak to whose view is, well, I'll just keep making money from extraction and somebody else will clean up afterwards. I don't think that will work. There may be very expensive cleanup costs, and I think it's increasingly difficult to persuade investors that this is the right way for a business to behave. My warning to businesses is always, don't fall into the trap of sticking to the left-hand side of this slide. Think over on the other side. How are we going to reframe businesses? Certainly, we will need to reframe government policies, we will need to reframe markets, but actually a huge drive will come from the businesses themselves thinking through their options. Firstly, this may seem strange for an extractive sector that is so distant from the consumer end of the supply chain, but actually it's absolutely crucial that the whole way along the supply chain, companies are talking about what are the service people need. This is very evident in terms of thinking about mobility, which massively affects oil and gas firms. It's not just a question of whether we move from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles. It is also a question of whether people start moving from the vehicle as a good that we own to the idea of mobility as a service that we access. But I can see this happening across a whole range of sectors, and this will ultimately affect the materials that people will be using. And then when you take the diagrams of the circular economy that Elisa and Kristen shared with us earlier, it is quite clear that as you move into that circularity, if extractive firms are to maintain their business in this model, they will really have to address how their products are used within the market. And that means they will have to talk down along their supply chain. They will have to talk to their investors. Second is, what are the structural changes we would need to work towards? Now, some of the earlier speakers have talked about how we might introduce policies that would affect the or drive us towards a circular economy. I think Bodhi's talk very strongly showed another aspect of these structural changes, which is that businesses, both in how they run themselves and how they engage with their local communities and how they report to their investors, really need to think in a different way about the business. Structurally, businesses will need to be much more embedded in their communities. They will need to be much more open to dialogue with their communities. But also the way that we think about how a company invests, particularly how a company may invest in a third country, we need to rethink the structure of those relationships, which brings me on to my final point here, dialogue. And I'm really pleased that all of the other speakers have also made reference to this. One of the issues that we in E3G spend a lot of time doing is building coalitions and dialogue. And the earlier you start those conversations, the faster one can move, firstly, to the right set of policies that work for everybody, but also the right understandings, so that businesses have the right understanding of what their role is, but also they are bringing consumers, they're bringing the public, they are bringing their community stakeholders and indeed their workers along with them, all of which will be vital as the extractive sector addresses the Sustainable Development Goals and a world changing due to climate change. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Yeah.
Over to you, Kumi.
Yeah, thank you very much. That concludes our set of presentation, and we would like to go to now panel discussion. Can I invite all the panelists to come back on the screen right now, please, so that participants can see everybody? Yeah, hi, welcome back. Okay, so thank you very much. And Ronan, thank you for bringing us back to what it means for businesses and companies, and especially myself, coming from OECD, I tend to think of what should policymakers do, what should governments do, but it's also important to translate that into company perspective. What does it all mean from where they're sitting? Okay, so thank you. We have quite a few questions from webinar participants. And as I flagged earlier, there are a couple of questions specifically to the extractive activities in Africa. For example, and then there are a couple of them related to some service providers, like water treatment service provider, trying to help the mining sector to be more sustainable in terms of water pollution and other aspects, but are having some difficult time to try to get into the scene with a particular government, for example. Maybe I can hand this over to you, Buddy, if you had time to have a look at, consider that question about the role, what service providers and private sectors can do in this context of the greening of the mining and other extractive sectors in Africa. What's been, I mean, you already mentioned about the environmental aspects that the EITI is addressing, but maybe you can elaborate on this.
Yeah, thank you for that. I will try to be brief. So on that specific one, I don't have so much insight to share because we are primarily focused on transparency and accountability as a primary mechanism for intervention in our member countries. We do try to promote evidence-based policies. So in cases where government include issues like this, you mentioned Togo in the example in one of the questions. So Togo is, for example, one country that includes its EITI reporting water, its water treatment, its water as a resource that it's extracted and that is sold, and how, and it's actually a very unique case that is worth examining further. So if you're interested in that, there is a specific report on our website on that. But I wanted to comment very briefly on the earliest comment on what are the opportunities for African government from Bukhari. Just very briefly to say that this is, we can look at this in two ways, but I would like to see this from the perspective of opportunities for change, especially in countries where there are very little infrastructure developed already. This is an opportunity for not developing infrastructure that would be polluting. It's to develop an infrastructure that is more sustainable, that you can create a lifestyle that is more sustainable. So going around and slapping asphalt everywhere and so on is not the most sustainable way forward. That means rethinking the investment in infrastructure, what type of infrastructure is most needed, and thinking about infrastructure, both digital infrastructure and physical infrastructure, because sometimes digital infrastructure may be much more productive in improving this country's productivity before the physical infrastructure. And just lastly on that one, it is also the African government's responsibility to engage more constructively in this debate. We know there is an issue of inequity that African countries have not historically contributed to the pollution, to the crisis, but it is suffering from the consequences. Having said that, it's not advisable to be in a denial position or to say it's somebody else caused this and they should fix it. I think there is an opportunity for using existing technologies that were not available even 20 years ago to move into new areas in terms of solar energy, for example, that's more developed and more quickly, cleanly, rather than cold, for example, and so on and so forth. So there are many opportunities that I don't have time to go into here in detail, but I just want to highlight those.
Thank you very much, Buddy. There are a couple of questions that have been posed early on in the course of the webinar, by a couple of questions that both related to the job impacts and labor market transition. And most recently, Ronan reminded us that these extractive companies provide many things, positive and negative, but one important thing is job creation at the local level. And also, the earlier speakers stressed the importance of being inclusive in this solution at different points in value chain. So what kind of strategies can countries or localities or companies even have to manage the labor transition, the job impacts of the move to circular and low carbon economy? Who wants to take up this question? Maybe can I turn to the first two speakers who mentioned this aspect? Can I come to Elisa?
Happy to reflect on that, and maybe this will also give me a little bit of an opportunity to dovetail with what Buddy was mentioning in conjunction with the role of African countries. During last month at the African Ministerial Conference on the Environment, building circularity in the economy of the African countries was actually one of the 3 themes that the ministers had selected to discuss on for the purpose of this conference. And they actually really saw that the first step, which was important for them to carry out, was to understand what circular economy entails, what are the implications of circularity for countries in Africa. I think we all are used probably to a narrative around circular economy, which is not necessarily a narrative that applies to all geographies in the world. And the business opportunities, the technology opportunities, and the job opportunities would definitely be different depending on where a specific country sits in the context of the value chain. In our experience into tackling both circularity and inclusiveness and job implication in Africa on specific value chain has started to tell us how the narrative is different. Where we see, for example, a lot of the countries in Africa coming to the agenda of circularity is actually being pressured by a growing waste problem at the level of cities, including waste of hazardous nature, and wanting to transform a narrative of waste as a problem into a narrative of waste as a resource and an opportunity for development and productivity. So rethinking that resource in such a way that it's correctly collected and taken care of in such a way that those parts of those products that are really valuable can again feed into their economies. And several examples would speak in African countries to electronics waste and the very precious resources that are part of that product and that currently get either dumped or, in the best scenarios, landfilled. So how to take advantage of those resources, bring them back to the economy, create new productivity opportunities to reprocess them, bring them back to the economy, and at the same time, make sure that those actors that are part of the economy and that take care currently of the collections, of the recycling or the disassembling, are actually enabled to improve the quality and the standard of their working condition from the social and environmental standpoint, because they actually play an important role into creating that circular economy. So this speaks a lot about really making sure that there are opportunities to improve one's knowledge and one's skill in the labor market, or eventually get reskilled to be part of one of those who will get re-employed in that new business opportunities that emerge in the context of circularity. So what emerged as one of the findings of the African Ministerial Conference of the Environment is that actually the governments had really requested to help them design a program that meets the implications of circularity for Africa, and make sure that private sector is brought on board. It was flagged in a number of interventions that this transformation of the economy really needs the different actors to be coming together, to be aligned along the same horizon. And Badi already flagged a very important point that came up very, very loudly in the course of the discussion, which is one of infrastructure for Africa. So a strong call for new infrastructure to be in place, but above all, an infrastructure which is already designed with circularity in mind. So again, some of the concerns flagged by countries where proposal of huge investment also from public authorities into infrastructure that might run the risk of locking them into a linear model. So this is definitely a risk countries need to be aware of and think rather of the future and the transition to the future that they want in thinking of the transformation that they will need to go through.
Thank you, Elisa. Do other panelists want to come in on this point, on the issue of transition management? Yes, Kirsten? Sorry, we can't hear you. We can't hear you. Kirsten.
You can? Excellent. Good, thank you. I just wanted to add on to what Elisa was saying, which is that the Mineral Resource Governance Report from the International Resource Panel has also found that extractive resources will continue to play a central role in the global economy, despite efforts to decouple the economies from resource use. And as Elisa was also saying, the primary minerals and metals demand can significantly be reduced through circular economy. And as she was also highlighting, through eco-design and recycling and refurbishment, etc., as well as also through secondary sources of metals and minerals from industrial waste, from tailings, etc. And one of the main messages of the Mineral Resource Governance Reports, perhaps we are now moving along a bit further in the discussion, is that the authors recommend extending the well-known social license to operate to gain, for the extractive industry, to gain trust of the local communities, and to basically develop a so-called sustainable development license to operate framework. And this framework would expand the SLO, and it would include consensus-based principles and best practices and policy options that are directly in line with the Sustainable Development Goals and the targets. And so I think this is also a very interesting concept to think about, and also in line of our follow-up work to UNEA 4, to the Resolution on Mineral Resource Governance, to try and think about how we can work towards getting some sort of global resolution or something of the sort going. So that was my comment.
No, thanks, Kirsten. I think Rona wanted to come in on this.
Yes, thank you very much, Kumi. Just to observe that your colleagues in other parts of the OECD always stress the value of education. Can I make a link between extractive industries and education, please? Which is, extractive industries move to where the material is. It might just be possible that the material is sitting next to a city that's already very well populated and very well educated. It might be way out in the countryside. Even within densely populated Europe, we have our oil and gas all in the North Sea, so we have had to push people to the edges of our islands in order to access this. So it is really important to recognize that the extractive industries have a very particular role here. And secondly, and I think even the illustration that's in front of people here with the three enormous mining trucks in a very large mining field remind us that these can often be quite specific skills, which once the extraction is exhausted, what then happens? And then I would go back to Dadia's point about the infrastructure, both the physical infrastructure, but also the educational infrastructure that enables extraction to work wherever it is, needs to be smart. It needs to be designed, as I think it was Kristen said, with circularity built in from the beginning, but it also needs to be designed in such a way that the mine itself, the extraction itself, is not the only thing we are taking here, but we are also using it as part of an education and training policy, that we are also using it as part of a developing maybe electricity into an area or telecommunications into an area, which will continue to have value, whatever happens to the extraction facility. Thank you.
No, thank you, Ron. And that reminds me, in fact, last year's OECD Green Growth Forum focused exactly on this topic of how to manage the transition and how all parties, not just government, national governments, local governments, communities, companies, need to be part of this reskilling and revitalization of an affected locality. Because very often these extractive activities are, as rightly said already, concentrated in particular part of a country, and there might be a mismatch between a location and mobility of labor. I mean, capital is free to move. Human capital is a little bit harder. It's a little bit less mobile. So, no, thank you for that. We have also some questions from the audience related to innovation. And I think we also have it on the screen. So let us turn on the technological and business model innovation. Some of this was already touched on. But if I may turn to a specific question, if I can find it again. Yes. How can government incentives, and Ronan said in carrots and sticks, a question, but if you may come back to that, in order to really spur the new technology that's needed to make this transition. Does anybody on the panel want to elaborate on this point? I go to Ronan again.
Well, no, I can.
Sorry, that also goes to the. I want to emphasize again. It was mentioned already, but the role of government procurement. I think it was Elisa who mentioned it, and the role of government in making the necessary infrastructure that was mentioned again. But beyond that, on the question of innovation.
So certainly a few things here, and I was certainly going to mention the role of procurement in this. Governments already in a great many areas procure innovative things and use their money, hopefully wisely. But I certainly think that there is more scope for governments across the world to deliberately use procurement policy to drive innovation and to explore how effective new techniques are. There are ways of doing this that where governments could really help the transition through their expenditure. Clearly, there are incentive schemes that can be used, and in particular, again, we use things like the Horizon Europe in the EU to help us develop ideas and technologies here. However, as a former regulator myself, I'm also very keen on regulators, whether environmental regulators or economic regulators, actually looking at how they regulate and trying to find ways in which they can safely push our companies to do something more in terms of innovation. This is particularly true, I think, where utility companies might be quite tightly regulated all across the world, but in fact, that tight regulation can deliberately encourage them to innovate for a better transition. So I think there are quite a lot of policy opportunities there. I did say this should not all be in terms of in terms of incentives. We have seen huge innovations in terms of the internal combustion engine and how the automobile can develop to be more efficient. That has largely been by pushing up the standards all of the time. So this has to be two-sided, if I could put it like that. Thank you, Kim.
And I also noted the point you made earlier about the business model change, and then it's not the product, it's a service. What services are being demanded by the consumer? It's a mobility, yes, not necessarily a vehicle. So that's yes, another point. I think Elisa wanted to comment on this point.
Yes, Kumi, I wanted to reflect a little bit on the experience we had in promoting both innovative technology and innovative business models in even small and medium-sized enterprises across the world. And what we actually found is that there are good opportunities, especially in the context of innovation funds, to really get access to resources to promote innovation and innovation for sustainability. What is, however, very important is that the need for that innovation continues over time. So we all are aware of the cycle that innovation has and new technologies and new ideas have. And if there is not a clear demand for them, they might not resist over time. So one of the points that were raised also from some of the questions coming in is very much related to the market. And I think this is an important aspect to really make sure that there is continuity and sustainability in the innovation, in the transformation we're pushing for. And therefore, calling for innovation because the market needs that innovation and the market wants that innovation and those new products, and shifting from product to service is definitely the best way to make sure that they remain over time. These can be achieved obviously through procurement, being that public procurement, but also procurement in business-to-business relationship, especially across value chains that extend across multiple countries, but also making sure that there is transparency across what happens to the products that go to the market. And products reach the market with a label or with information that actually qualifies what has happened to them throughout the process, and that we really have a clear understanding of the full life cycle of this product, as well as there are very important opportunities that can be taken advantage of while engaging all of us as citizens and consumers when we are aware of the implications that a product might have, or when we are aware that certain products are actually not good for the environment or might have important social implications. We can definitely play an important role. And if I may, just connecting to one of the topics that I have there on media, if we see what has been happening vis-a-vis plastic pollution and the drive that consumers have been having by having campaigns addressing them, gaining a fuller understanding of what those products might have in terms of impact, this has definitely created a change in the market and more awareness and more understanding.
It's not only regulation, but also the consumer demand side that can shift the tide. Let us turn to a question that came from one of the participants. So if the governments are trying to put regulatory frameworks and incentives in mind, and if there's going to be new regulation to really help them become greener, or tightening rather, do you think there might be a risk of green paradox, meaning all this is going to spike activities in mining ahead of trying to go ahead of the tightening of regulation? May I turn to Buddy on this point?
Yeah, we hear about this question a lot. The main point is that actually the way the mining industry is structured, this risk is minimal. And that's just because the life of the project is just much longer than taking advantage of some kind of the wind of regulation. But it's a good point. The main point being that there are I would just say that when the standard is raised on the environmental, social, and governance standards, of course, the entire industry has to adjust to that, and there may be some kind of lag before they adjust, and all the industry doesn't apply the same kind of standards. So I can see that being a challenge, but generally, the so-called green paradox, I think, is a little bit overblown.
We have less than 10 minutes left, but we could end with one big tough question. Actually, a couple of the questions posed by the participants touch on the fact that we have different regulatory regime in different jurisdictions, and the issue of do we need a carbon adjustment on the border? This came out in the conference last week also. So let's throw out to the floor and let's see which of the panelists would like to take it up first. The question of carbon pricing. Is there any hope to make it global? Do we have the right environment or political climate to do this today? Who wants to take up on this? Buddy?
Maybe I can go first. The first point being, and this point was made by other participants at the OECD as well last week, that this is a global issue. It does require cooperation at the international level to find solutions, because the polluters and those who are the most affected, at least at the most vulnerable communities for the climate crisis, are not always the same. There are disparities within regions. So depending on geology, some countries are affected, but they also are producers of carbon, of oil or so on. Others are not so lucky, and therefore they suffer the consequences without even having any geology for contributing in any way in this area. So they are just victims. So there is a need for cooperation, for finding solutions at international level, recognizing that in the current environment that may be challenging. But it is certainly, we can always try the local approaches, but there will come to a point where that may not be sustainable. Right now, at national level, the disparities within countries, that can be regulated very well. So the polluters also between urban and rural is very different. So if you look at pollution per capita and so on, so that could be regulated at national level, but when it comes to inequities and so on at international level, that we require collaboration that we do not see the environment lending itself to right now.
Okay, thank you, Buddy. Can I turn to Kirsten on this issue also?
Of course. So I would like to go back once again to the idea that we have to also tackle, as we were saying in the beginning with Elisa as well, the emissions that are even produced through the production of food and land management, etc., and that we have to make sure that we now, through circular economy, can tackle and reduce emissions to begin with already on this side, in addition to the emissions caused through our energy systems. And now we already have renewable energy and energy efficiency systems in place, but I believe we need to tackle the other side of the coin, so to say, and make sure that we also look into the product side through circular economy.
Okay.
If I could,
Myself.
if I could come in on this.
Yes,
Thank
please
you.
go ahead.
Yeah. So just to say, firstly, a carbon tax or a trading scheme, or however one puts that additional price, is clearly a very important element of the solution here. These can be quite complex mechanisms. Trading regimes take a long time to develop. There is a whole world of tax policy to to be in there. And indeed, it was quite interesting that across the conference floor from us in Paris last week, it was a similar conference on international taxation. We should perhaps have merged the two at one stage, because this is such an important thing to think through. I think realistically, one might be able to address these in a certain set of bilateral engagements between countries in terms of trade deals. The difficulties even within the single market area of the European Union to get the agreement on how a tax should work together, and the very interesting discussions we're about to launch on a border tax adjustment will be quite, let's just say they will be very interesting, and I'm looking forward to them very much. But it is a very complex area. Tax is not the only thing that we need here. We do need strong regulations, and we do need much more transparency, as was mentioned much earlier in this debate, in terms of the actual content of the products that reach the consumer. And assurance schemes, which Body represents one, are also really important here. There are a lot of instruments. We will all be working on carbon tax. I recognize it will be a tough one.
Thank you very much. Yes, there's no single silver bullet. And international initiatives such as the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Change, and this is very encouraging because it's not about just product standard, environmental standards. Very often other parts of the government, such as fiscal authority and the finance ministries, also need to have a role to play in this. But as Roland said, other issues such as product standards and environmental regulations are also very important. And again, going back to the role of business and communities, it really needs every corner of society, from government, national, across different ministry, across different levels of government, different industrial sectors, research community for R&D, labor unions, community leaders. I think everybody has a role to play, and that was one of also the key messages that came across. So, and then I would like to, I think, need to close. Unfortunately, we could keep going for a while, but I think time is up. And again, I would like to thank the Green Growth Knowledge Partnership for providing us this opportunity to have this webinar and a panel discussion. And thank you all the participants for having contributed. And then I think this was recorded, and also some of the summary will be available on the GGKP website. So stay tuned for the next webinar, and thank you everybody. Have a nice afternoon. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.